Kim Burton doing the same mathematics that we have, and she knows that her husband will join the legendary Fireball Roberts as the only driver in NASCAR history to lead every lap in a super speedway race.
Leading every lap, a feat that hasn't been done since Jeff Burton nearly 20 years ago on that sunny day in New Hampshire. Cale Yarborough is the driver to lead the most laps in a race by leading all 500 in 1973 at Bristol. That record is almost definitely unreachable, and it sets the furthest out corner of the Lapagami board. Now, what is Lapagami, you may ask? Well, it's a made-up term, something I came up with, but I define it as the art of leading laps, and it is something so prevalent yet precious that to this day it still creates unique Lapagamis. This is the full board empty, back in 1949, at the beginning of NASCAR's history. Throughout this video, we will fill in the board through the seasons and watch it take shape. But before we fill the board, let's look at how this board works. Along the top is the finishing positions. Nowadays the field is 40, but this will expand far out beyond 40 as we begin. Right now it's at 32 as we're just starting with the board. On the vertical axis is the laps led number. This right now runs down to only 200, as in the early years of NASCAR, no race went past this mark. But as with the finishing position, that will expand as we go on throughout the history as well. Now, you may notice that this board only reaches down to 60 that you're seeing. Well, it does go beyond 60, but due to how small it gets once you zoom out past 60, what we see here, I have left it down to this point so you can at least see some detail while we're going through the history. I will pan around throughout the video to show the full board and what I'm explaining. Now, to make a Lapagami, it's simple. Just lead laps and finish someone. Let's say you lead 19 laps and finish 14th. That Lapagami would end up right here. Third place in 14 laps, here, and theoretically, under current green-white checker rules, this board could technically go on forever, and NASCAR could also theoretically expand the field forever, so they could have as many cars and as many laps as possible. We could get something crazy like 131st and 900 laps left. But for now we're going to be realistic. You may also notice that there are no blacked out squares on this board. People can be disqualified and still keep their laps led. Well, how does that work? Let's take a look at the Cup Series' first race at the Old Charlotte Speedway. Jim Roper won by completing 197 to 200 laps in the race. Glenn Dunaway, who was the original winner, was DQ'd for having illegal rear shocks, and the win was granted to Roper. Now in this scenario, they took his laps led away. But as recent as 2019 in the Xfinity Series, they DQ'd AJ Allmendinger at Daytona from third place when he led 33 laps. But he kept those laps led and officially finished 38th. So this goes off of a case-by-case basis generally. Back to the inaugural season of 1949, however, this is what the board will look like after its first season. Now there is some vast variance in this. The person to lead only 6 laps and win was eventual champion that year, Red Byron, who won the beach and road course race at Daytona that year. On the exact opposite spectrum, Bob Flock led 200 laps and set the highest Lapagami of the year. Now some other dots are sprinkled around. The person to lead the most laps and not win was 180 by Bill Blair at North Wilkesboro in the season finale. Now ironically, previous benchmarker Bob Flock won that race after Blair fell out of the race with a blown engine. For the first season, the results are very scattered. Things seem primitive, and right now, nothing really sticks out as interesting. For 1950, the board fills in a little more. The first driver to lead a singular lap in a race occurred with Red Harvey at Dayton Speedway. That was the only lap Harvey led in his entire career, making only one more start, also finishing top 10 in that race as well. One of the furthest outliers also occurred in the sophomore season of the Cup Series, when Curtis Turner started the inaugural Southern 500 from the pole and led 22 of the opening 30 laps. However, shortly after Turner would lose the lead and drop back, on lap 275, he flipped over and plummeted down the 75 car field. He finished 60th with 22 laps led. Also in the inaugural Southern 500, the first driver to lead more than 200 laps in a race occurred. Eventual race winner Johnny Mance dominated and led a staggering 351 laps, putting him all the way down here on the sheet. Now, through the first few years of the sport, it continued to grow, and that is evident on the Lapagami board, as more and more dots begin to fill it in. In 1953, the first driver to win leading only one lap occurred. In the Daytona Beach and Road Course race, Fonny Flock dominated the day, leading every single lap except the last one. On the final circuit of the 39-lap race, Fonny ran out of gas, and Bill Blair flew by, making the 1953 Beach and Road Course race the first race decided by a last lap pass. Flock was eventually pushed back to the pits by fellow driver Slick Smith, who was running 8th at the time. Smith's friendly gesture cost him 2 spots, and ended up 10th, while Flock was able to save his second place finish. As the 50s progressed, the board continued to get greener. In 1955, the furthest back finisher to ever lead a lap occurred. Fireball Roberts in the M1 car finished 66th after leading 4 laps starting from the pole. This is the farthest back in history someone has finished after leading any laps in a race ever. And with the way the sport is now, this record will probably never be broken. Coming up to 1957, the first driver to ever lead more than 400 laps in a race occurred. Bob Wellborn dominated the day at Martinsville, leading 435 of 500 laps and claiming his first ever career victory. Wellborn holds the record for most laps led in a first career victory, another marker that may never be broken. By the 1960s, NASCAR had begun making more and more races longer than 200 laps. More and more Lapagamis at 200 plus and 300 plus laps led continue to be made. But at the top of the board, some holes still needed filling. Oddly enough, nobody had still led exactly 2 laps and won a race. Same thing with 4 and 10. You would think leading anywhere between 1 to 8 laps and finishing 10th would be pretty common. But by 1960, it still had never happened. But in that same regard, someone had finished 66th and done it in 59, twice in a matter of fact. As the 60s progressed on, though, these gaps did begin to fill, and by 1963, more of the common spots were finally getting filled. Bob Wellborn's lap-led record in a race was broken by Fred Lorenzen, leading 452 at the old Asheville-Weaverville Speedway. His record would not last for long, however. In 1964, the 452 mark was exceeded 3 times, and all 3 times by Lorenzen himself. At Bristol in 1964, he led a record-setting for the time 494 of 500 laps led. About a month later, he went to Martinsville and led 487 of 500. And when the series came back in the fall to the paperclip, Lorenzen again led 493 of 500 laps en route to another victory. 1964 was a good year for Lapagami. As a matter of fact, to this day, it is the year with the most ever in a season. 102 new Lapagamis were created, the only time it has ever eclipsed 100, and a mark that will probably never be broken. As the 60s continued to progress, more of the easier Lapagamis were being filled up. By the end of the 60s, the sheet looked like this. After nearly 1,000 races, this much white space still remained. Looking at the first place Lapagamis, Every single one within 100 laps besides 2 had been filled. 68 laps led in a win, and 86. Now weirdly enough, those numbers are inverse of one another, but they're the only spots of white along the first place column for a while. The next highest one is 137, and generally speaking, it's not like it's uncommon for somebody to lead 60 plus laps in a race, or even 80 plus laps, and then go on to win the race. But for now, entering the 70s, those remain unfilled. Back to the top of the sheet, there's still various low number ones still in the top 10. Nobody by 1970 had led 5 laps and finished 5th. Same thing with 10 laps and 10th. People had finished 28th and led 2 laps, 3 laps, 4 laps, and 5 laps. Even 6, but never just 1. A phallic creation is down at the 17th place position, and various domination stories about being so good but coming up short are sprinkled across the barren sea of white past 200 laps. As we progress through the 70s, NASCAR goes modern. What you see now is the Lapagami board at the changeover to the modern era. Every first place Lapagami south of 200 is filled, besides 68, 86, and 143. Almost every position within the top 43 have led exactly 1 lap besides 5, 16th, 24th, 26th, 40th, and 41st. Going into the modern era, the number of races dips from around 50 per year to at least 30. This is evident in the Lapagami. In 1972, there were only 34 Lapagamis, the lowest since 1949, where there were only 8 races in the season. In 1973, though, Lapagami made a recovery adjusting to the new era. 46 remained, and in 1973, the most notable Lapagami was set proudly. The highest one ever. As mentioned before, on that day in 1973 at Bristol, Cale Yarborough led all 500 laps, a record that will probably never be broken. Cale has set the benchmark, the furthest down point on the Lapagami table, and by the mid-70s, Lapagami had fully adjusted to the modern era. And by the end of the 70s, Lapagami looked like this. Looking at the first place Lapagamis, almost all are filled within the first 200, but still 2 stand, 68 and 86. Leading 500, 495, 494, 487, all of these have been achieved, but still nobody has led exactly 68 or 86 laps and won. The next closest one is 222, but that makes a little more sense as to maybe why it isn't filled. Leading north of 200 laps is kind of difficult. And going down, you can see the first place column becomes sparser and sparser and more dotted instead of a filled line. Back to the top, most of it is greener. Still, there are some vacancies. Still, nobody has led exactly 8 laps and finished 6th, 10 laps and 10th, 5 laps and 10th, and other various missing spaces. But as the sport continues to modernize, more spaces that you would think fill do. In 1983, somebody finally leads exactly 10 laps and finishes 10th. In the fall Charlotte race, Cale Yarborough led 10 laps and finished 10th, 1 lap down to Richard Petty. A meaningless feat at first glance, but looking deeper, it took 1,306 races for anyone to accomplish this. Ironically enough, 3 races later at Riverside, the feat was accomplished again by Richard Petty leading 10 laps and finishing 10th. In the season finale, what was something that couldn't be done for over 35 years was now accomplished twice in a span of 35 days. As the 80s went on, much of the Lapagamis of 10 laps or less were getting filled. At the beginning of the 80s, within the top 40 positions, with 10 laps or less, 64 were not filled. By the end of the 80s, that was down to 38. Top 5 Lapagamis were also becoming less and less. Many of the easier ones had been filled now, but through it all, 2 Lapagamis still stood heading into the 90s, 68 and 86. In over 40 years, nobody had still led exactly 68 or 86 laps and won. On top of that, every first place Lapagami through till 226 had been filled besides these two. In 1990, 68 and 86 survived, and through to 92, there was no threat to either 68 or 86. But for 1993, the threat for 68 came from the haven of the Gami.
The world's leader in motorsports coverage welcomes you live to Bristol International Raceway in Tennessee for the NASCAR Winston Cup Bud 500.
Bristol Motor Speedway is a fantastic track for Lapagami. Just theoretically speaking, you run 500 laps there. More laps run provides more opportunity for Lapagami. With this theory in place, it makes short tracks the best place for Lapagami, and road courses the worst. The less laps you run, the less likely of a chance you are to get a Lapagami, especially as time goes on. It's not that hard in a 267 lap race to lead 20 laps, but at a road course, it's extremely difficult. At Bristol, 20 laps is 5 minutes in the lead. At Watkins Glen, 20 laps is 20 minutes in the lead. It's late in the race, and Rusty Walls has dominated, leading 400 plus laps. But Mark has come on late and is stalking Walls. Martin has led on and off on various occasions, and with one Bristol bump and run, he could take the win. Coming into 3, he has the opportunity, which if he takes, he can lead exactly 68 laps the rest of the way and win. Coming into 3, he doesn't take it. He waits and gets him clean. Mark Martin's clean attitude saved the 68 Lapagami, but also made another one. Rusty finished second and led 409 laps, creating a new Lapagami. This is only the third time that somebody has ever led exactly 409 laps. The first time was in 1979 when Darrell Waltrip led 409 to 420 to win at Nashville Speedway. Rusty is the other two. Rusty won earlier in 1993 at Martinsville and led exactly 409 laps. And here tonight, he finished second and led exactly 409 laps. To this day, nobody has led exactly 409 laps since, making Rusty the last person to do it. While the 409 second place Lapagami is filled, the 68 first place Lapagami seems unaccomplishable. Nearly 50 years, and not a soul has done it. Even the haven of Lapagami, Bristol Motor Speedway, can't defeat it. It's very likely we may never see the 68 Lapagami.
The start of the race. Sears Point Raceway, as we said, 2.5 miles in length, will go 74 laps. The pole speed was 91.514 miles an hour. The record for this race is 81.4 miles an hour. They'll stop somewhere between 30 and 35 laps, and the purse they're going for almost $900,000.
Ernie Irvan is hot with his new team at Robert Yates Racing, and he comes to Sears Point with the most confidence he's ever had. He dominates the day, and only through pit cycle and cautions he loses the lead. With 16 to go, he has taken the lead from Morgan Shepherd. And with 52 laps led so far, if he can make it home, he will lead exactly 68
all the bugs work out, and
laps.
it looks like Road Atlanta is a very contested place for Sears Point.
Off of corner number 11, Ernie Irvan sees the checkered flag waving, and Ernie Irvan crosses the line and wins his third race of 1994 and registers his 12th career win in his 186th start.
After 1,706 Cup races, someone has finally done it. But there's still one more to fill. 86. Coming in the 1995, we see another dock get filled. Finishing 6th and leading 8 laps, it's still never been done. But at Michigan, Dale Jarrett led exactly 8 laps, and fell to 6th, where he would finish, becoming the first person to do so. By the end of the 90s, every first place dot through 250 is filled, besides 3. 248, 228, and 86. So far, entering the 21st century, there has been 2,830 Lapagamis, spanning across 66 finishing positions and 500 laps. And nobody has won leading exactly 86 laps. Will it ever be conquered?
Laps here this afternoon at Bristol Motor Speedway. The purse exceeds $2.3 million, and the race record was set way back in 1977 by Cale Yarborough.
Bristol Motor Speedway. On the weekend of the 27th anniversary of the 500-lap dominance Lapagami, set by Cale Yarborough, Rusty Wallace, in his 50th win, he pulls it off. Finally, 2 of the oddest Lapagamis had been fulfilled. Into the 2000s, the board continues to fill. By 2002, a little Sigma-looking shape has formed, and as time goes on, the board gets greener and greener. Moving into the 2010s, getting closer to current day, most of the low number part of the board is filled. And now, at current day 2021, the time of this video being made, this is the Lapagami board. Still some interesting areas haven't been filled. 19th and 8 laps, 9th and 14 laps, 21st and 9 laps. But sadly, Lapagami is trending to its slow death. Now theoretically, there are endless Lapagamis. Under current rules, races can theoretically never end, so laps can endlessly be counted. However, it is exhaustible. The pace it has been on can't go on forever. This chart here shows the trending decline it has been on for nearly 50 years. Now this can be viewed as a sad thing if throughout this video you now become a fan of Lapagami, but Lapagami in a sense is a pretty meaningless thing. Nobody has ever aimed to do this. Nobody has probably even thought of this until now. And even then, no driver will go on track and aim to finish 13th with exactly 21 laps led. But what makes this intriguing, what makes this interesting, what grabs my attention, maybe yours, is the stories, trends, and random empty squares it leaves behind. It piques the curiosity. And for now, in 2021, we can still enjoy the occasional Lapagami.
Now 2.5 back. Martin Truex Jr. wins the Goodyear 400 at Darlington.
That's an answer.